Welcome back, folks, to our recorded lectures for HI 237. This is Viking Hopscotch, early raiding in the north. So today we are finally on to talking about actual raids. Our focus is going to be on early raiding in the British Isles because it is a section of this history that almost always gets skipped over to a degree because we know so little of it. The focus always tends to be on the Great Army, which arrives in 865, and that's justified in some ways because it had such cataclysmic effects on England. But it is, one chapter in a much longer story. Looking at the earlier chapters, or trying to, is what today is about. We're attempting to develop a more complete picture of the history in question. And certainly I would like to refute the stereotypes of the English and the Irish as simply helpless victims. So why do I call it hopscotch? Well, it's because we can't actually presume that northern seamen essentially mapped out the Scottish Islands in their early exploration. So basically they are playing hopscotch, jumping from one to the other as they move westward. Because getting out of sight of land is not particularly desirable. Remember, we talked about how their shipbuilding technology develops rapidly over the course of the Viking Age. And in this case, we are talking about the early 8th century. So there is much development left to come. And being out on the open sea is a bit concerning. This is not to say that they were never out of sight of land, but going from island to island was a bit safer. Now, there is some very sketchy evidence for this. One example is a cosmographical work by an Irish monk, de Cuil, and it reports on how he was told by hermits that they were driven away from their island retreats by pirates. So a lot of the monks from Ireland or from Scotland who were looking to live the life of an ascetic, because of course there are no deserts in Northern Ireland or in Scotland, they would look for the equivalent in isolation, and then island was the best way to do that. Now, were these pirates Vikings? Possibly. Possibly not. It's not an absolute certainty, but it is a plausible assumption, I would argue. I mean, it is very likely that the Norse would have used the islands as places to spend the winter if they had been raiding in the summer and they were too far to get back safely before the real bad weather actually set in. And wintering bases could have served as footholds and allowed them to familiarize themselves with the region even further. Now, by the late 8th century, we do see the beginnings of raids against the northern monasteries. And there's a certain degree of irony to this, after all. I mean, the holy men of the north had been used to regarding the sea as a route to pilgrimage. The sea is a major focus of Celtic Christianity. So the idea that fire and death came from the sea is a very tragic twist on this old tale. And that may have been partially the reason why our sources talk about it in such an apocalyptic sort of way. Now, the first major raid was thought to be against the island of the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793. But we have some evidence from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle to suggest that the Northmen showed up in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms a few years earlier than that. And that brings us to our first reading. So, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is basically our biggest historical source for the Anglo-Saxon period, with the possible exception of Bede, who was obviously earlier. They are annals, recording history by the year. As your reader tells you, it's a difficult source to work with because it is actually a group of sources. There are 9 surviving manuscripts, not all complete, none of them the original, and the 9 contradict each other on a number of points. It also has, one has to say, a bit of a bias towards the history of Wessex, as it was Alfred the Great who turned it into a major project during his reign. So it's trying to weave together the various historical traditions of different kingdoms, but of course it's going to be slanted towards Wessex. And it also has to be conceded that the Chronicle omits or glosses over certain events that might have been inconvenient to record in detail. That being said, it also draws on sources we no longer have. So earlier annals, king lists, etc., and this is the only place where that information is preserved. So it's an essential source for the period. We just have to use it carefully. So when you read your first excerpt from this, which is Viking Raids on England, 759 to 850-51, try and pay as much attention to detail as possible. I'm going to be asking some very specific questions as a way of trying to get you to dig into the document at the Zoom session. All right, so let's talk about Lindisfarne. It may not have been the first attack, but it was certainly the first of the worst. It was a major religious center in England associated with St. Cuthbert and is basically the heart of the Northumbrian Church. The attack on it is recorded by Charlemagne's Royal Annals as a major event, which is kind of remarkable. The Franks were kind of busy at that point in their history, so taking note of something that happened in northern England gives you some sense of how significant it was. Now, the possible reason for the interest in it is that Charlemagne, of course, has a very important English member of his court. That is Alcuin of York, his chief court scholar. Alcuin keeps up his interest in English and Northumbrian affairs, even when he shifts to living in Francia. He is essentially Charlemagne's chief emissary to the English kings. And there are multiple surviving letters from him on the attack. You read one for this lecture. When you look at it, or presumably you may yet still be reading one for this lecture, if you haven't looked at it yet, try and figure out how he fits this dramatic event into his worldview. I mean, something like this is very disruptive to the order of the world for local Christians, and it really touches on the question of why do such horrible things happen, the problem of evil, right? We will take a closer look at it at the Zoom session, obviously. Now, beyond these letters, we have only very little surviving fragments. The reference in the Royal Frankish Annals is extremely brief. We do have an account in the history of St. Cuthbert from the 10th century. This is primarily an inventory of land grants and holdings that the monks of Lindisfarne created when they settled down again at their new location in Durham in 995. I mean, they did not leave Lindisfarne in 793. They didn't do that for decades, and possibly they only did that in the end because they figured their new estates inland were safer. I mean, even Cuthbert's relics are not transferred until sometime in the middle of the 9th century. Now, it is possible that they did so in the end due to escalating Viking attacks, but it's important to remember we can't ascribe it to that initial raid. Now, a much more significant account comes from Simeon of Durham's History of the Church of Durham. This was a man who was the master of the scriptorium, we think, and may have been the official historian of the community during his lifetime. Now, he was drawing on the oral tradition of Lindisfarne, and while he's writing 3 centuries later, he had access to details that those outside the community would not have known or remembered in such detail. Now, he claims that the raid happened on the 7th of the Ides of June, so the 13th of June. But the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says the 8th of January. I mean, how realistic is that you'd have a major raid in January? The dating of the raid in the Chronicle is likely to be scribal error, I believe is the general consensus. Simeon, we know, had more believable sources. The other major question, of course, is how bad the raid was. Alcuin clearly would have you believe it was a massacre. Simeon, while he uses some of the same rhetoric, also confirms that it wasn't a lethal blow to the community. He says that many of the monks survived, and they continued to live near Cuthbert's bones. Even the ecclesiastical see continued. The Lindisfarne Gospels survived. That's the famous manuscript from Lindisfarne. How did that happen if everything was destroyed? Now, it's important not to take Alcuin and Simeon too literally when they bemoan what happened to the community. What Simeon does give us, though, is our first account of the Vikings taking slaves. He claims that some of the brethren on Lindisfarne were slain, but others were carried off in chains. Alcuin also says that pagans took youths away into captivity. So this tells us that slavery was already a driving force among the raiders in 793. Another odd thing about the Lindisfarne raid is that it's portrayed as a sort of big but isolated raid, sort of like a hit and run. if you want to use that terminology. But if you take a close look at the sources, you see a different picture being presented. Simeon, for instance, talks about how the Viking fleet launched many other raids in the north of England before they reached Lindisfarne. And this is actually supported by another source, Bertfeth of Ramsey's Historia Regum, or History of the Kings, which is attributed to him. And he's another writer who incorporates fragments of other earlier sources. And in this case, it's the fragments of a lost northern history. And this is one that the Chronicle also incorporates. He talks about how the fleet overran the country in all directions. Simeon may have based his account on this as much as on the Lindisfarne oral tradition. So we have sources here that suggest that Lindisfarne was part of a wider pattern of raiding at the end of the 8th century. Now, here's the question. Are they projecting backwards? They would have been influenced by the later history of the period and the great army that overran England for so long. Or is there maybe another answer? All right, so here's the thing. Both the Historia Regum and Simeon claim that the pagans were rushing around destroying things in Britain. Now, did the Anglo-Saxons use that term? Would a 12th century writer have used that term? Would it help if I told you that Britain was often used to refer to Scotland as a way to distinguish it from Scotia, or, as that referred to, Northern Ireland? Now, the Scots came from Ireland originally. There was a kingdom that had holdings on both sides of the Irish Sea. If you didn't know that, this may have been rather confusing if you just happened to encounter it in the sources. But if we look at these two sources and we take it to mean that by Britain they actually meant the western half of the northern half of the island, where the Dalriata, or the Scots from Northern Ireland, settled, suddenly we have a cross-reference available from the Annals of Ulster. And they talk about how in 793 all the islands of Britain were devastated by the heathens. Now this makes a lot more sense. These initial raiders would have come from the Northern Isles, and an obvious target would have been these western regions. And it's further supported by Simeon and Bertfeth talking about how the attacks came out of the north, not from the continent. Now, Alcuin, on the other hand, may have been unaware of the Viking settlements in the Northern Islands, and so he instead got a little bit mixed up and identified them as related to the Saxons. The Saxons are one of the peoples that Charlemagne is fighting, especially those from the region of Jutland, whom he knew had shipbuilding techniques that could have carried them to northern Britain. Now, this might explain why, in another letter to the Bishop of Lindisfarne, he offers to ask Charlemagne, once he settles the Saxons down again, to see if he can't negotiate the release of some of the prisoners that were taken in the raid. I mean, that's a very well-intentioned offer. Alcuin just clearly has no idea what's going on and where those prisoners actually are. And it's important to remember that people on the ground in the midst of this, in a world with limited information gathering and information sharing abilities, would not have had a full understanding of what was happening. So this is also a really good indication as to why we need to read our sources as critically as possible. Words matter, and sometimes something as simple as the interpretation of a geographical name can change your view of history almost completely. All right, so we can see that Alcuin also expresses in some of his other letters his worries about what else might happen to holy places in Northumbria. We can assume he was most worried about Wearmouth Jarrow, which is Bede's great monastery with an equally famous library. He actually sends a warning letter to them in the same year. It's kind of a funny letter. He's basically saying, don't make God angry, you live by the sea too. And he was right to be worried. They were the targets of a raid in 794. It was damaging, but that's not the raid in which the monasteries were abandoned. We know that there was resistance here, At least 2 Viking leaders were said to have been hung outside the church at Wearmouth. Now, moving in a westerly direction, we have more evidence for attacks on monasteries. If you look at the Annals of Ulster, you have more references after that original bare-bones comment about the Northmen ravaging the islands. Now, why do we have these references? Basically because the Annals were based on the chronicle tradition from Iona. Now, we don't have the original chronicle from Iona. The initial raids, of course, affect northern churches like Iona most severely. When you read the section from the Annals of Ulster that you're assigned, that's Viking raids on Ireland, make sure you pay, again, close attention to detail. We're going to try and wring it for all that it's worth on Tuesday. There were more raids on monasteries, a whole sequence of them hitting major houses throughout the north, and the one on Iona was the big one. It was basically a blow to all of Celtic Christianity. It was like attacking Jerusalem. This is Columba's monastery. This is the center from which the whole north of England was converted. It had enormous prestige, and any damage to it was enormously traumatic. And, the apocalyptic overtones here were significant. In the Celtic cosmographical tradition, Iona was the first place on Earth to be made, and so if it is destroyed or damaged, there are scary implications there. Now, the initial raid was not too serious, we think. It's called a devastation by the Annals, but there isn't the kind of weeping and moaning and detailed inventory of the damage that you might expect. The hypothesis is that it was attacked by a couple of ships who located the island by chance and thought they'd take a closer look. Iona is kind of midway between Northern Ireland and Scotland. That would have been enough to account for the second raid, and this was the damaging one in 802. We know that the abbey was burned in that year, and in the annals it is actually the only raid recorded for the year. So is it possible, perhaps, that Iona was a deliberate target? All that is actually left of the original monastery is the vallum, the earthen rampart. The buildings of the original monastery were wood, so they would have been destroyed completely. The abbot of Iona decided that they couldn't hold out on the island, so they looked to the Irish mainland for a new place to call home. So they were given a grant of land at Kells by the monastery of Armagh. Now, this is actually a big deal. Armagh is St. Patrick's monastery, and one of the things the great monasteries of Ireland did is compete, sometimes violently, with each other. So the fact that Iona is in such trouble that Armagh immediately coughs up some land for them shows you just how serious a situation it was. The abbot, Kellach, immediately set about building a stone church at Kells, something that could be less easily burned. But unfortunately, they were attacked on Iona again in 806 before the move to Kells could be completed. So the annals tell us that 68 monks of the community were killed. That's probably about half of the population. Survivors were evacuated immediately to the new monastery, whether or not it was complete. There is a suggestion that some of the brothers did stay on the island to watch over the tomb of the kings. See, Iona, as well as being Columba's abbey, was a royal necropolis. There had been Scottish and Irish kings baptized there and buried there. The shrine of Columba, of course, was there as well. And we're told that once the new abbey had been completed, Kellach actually resigned his position and went back to Iona to die. The monks would return to their island 20 years later. This is not to say that Iona was never attacked again. It was, but it was never entirely deserted, although they did take Columba's relics out to safety at one point. But that is moving on into a different phase of raiding. Pretty much everything I have outlined for you about the progress of these early raids is highly debatable. I hope that gives you some sense of how open to interpretation all of these sources are. History in a period like this is about making your best guess and entertaining a range of possibilities. Okay, so that will do us for this week. I look forward to tearing apart these documents for everything they can give us with you guys on Tuesday. And have a great weekend.